You know, most empires collapse from economic strife or political rebellion. The Vorak Empire fell because they made one fatal miscalculation. They targeted a human child. I'm going to show you how an 8-year-old girl and a retired Marine turned a planetary bombardment into the most embarrassing military defeat in galactic history. You know, most galactic powers understand that terror has diminishing returns. The Vorak built their entire doctrine around it. They saw fear as a renewable resource, something they could harvest from every conquered world and reinvest in the next campaign. Their entire military apparatus operated on this principle: shock, awe, and psychological domination as primary weapons. They selected Haven's Rest precisely because it seemed defenseless, the perfect stage for their theater of fear. An agricultural outpost with minimal military presence, mostly families and farmers. From their perspective, it was like choosing the softest target in the sector to make the loudest statement. Their intelligence was catastrophically wrong about human psychology, especially regarding children. The Vorak observed human resource allocation patterns and saw what they wanted to see: logical beings who prioritized assets and strategic value. They noted how humans distributed medical care, educational resources, and protective measures across age groups. What they completely missed was the irrational, biological imperative that overrides all human logic when a child is threatened. They believed showing dominance over a child would break the human spirit across the entire sector, creating a psychological fracture point that would cascade through colonial defenses. This assumption came from watching human behavior through their own cultural lens, where young are considered expendable until they prove their strength. Vorak culture prized spectacle over efficiency, a weakness they never recognized. Their military ceremonies involved elaborate displays of force that served no tactical purpose beyond intimidation. Commanders were promoted based on the theatrical quality of their conquests, rather than strategic outcomes. This cultural blind spot meant they designed operations for maximum visual impact, rather than actual military effectiveness. Their standard protocol involved preliminary orbital bombing of symbolic targets: farms, communication towers, power grids, followed by landing troops in visible public spaces. The survivors would be paraded and enslaved in full view of any recording devices, creating content for their propaganda networks. Commander Vex was chosen to deliver this particular demonstration personally, believing it would be routine. He'd performed similar operations on 7 previous worlds, each time achieving the desired effect of complete submission. His selection reflected the Vorak emphasis on theatricality. He had a particular talent for delivering threats with calm, menacing precision. He practiced his lines, refined his posture, and studied human body language to maximize the psychological impact. The Vorak High Command considered this assignment so straightforward, they didn't even deploy their elite units. Just standard occupation troops with standard intimidation protocols. The entire strategy hinged on a flawed understanding of human emotional responses. They'd analyzed human reactions to threat scenarios, studied physiological responses to stress, even mapped neural activity during traumatic events. But they interpreted the data through their own evolutionary framework, where fear leads to submission and self-preservation overrides group bonds. They prepared for humans to calculate survival probabilities and make rational choices based on personal safety. Which brings us to the moment their perfectly calibrated plan met an 8-year-old girl who didn't follow their psychological models at all. The thing about humans is their young often don't behave predictably under threat. Their stress responses follow patterns that make perfect evolutionary sense if you understand Earth's predator history, but appear completely irrational to species who calculate survival probabilities differently. Where most galactic civilizations would expect a child to freeze, flee, or submit, human children sometimes do something else entirely. They ask questions about people they love. Emma Valdez was playing with a homemade jump rope in the central plaza when the Vorak shuttles descended. She'd been counting skips, completely absorbed in achieving a new personal record of 47 consecutive jumps without tripping. The shuttles came in low and loud, their repulsor engines kicking up dust clouds that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. Most species would have either run for cover or dropped into defensive postures. Emma stood her ground, squinting against the grit, still holding both ends of her rope. Instead of freezing in terror, she asked about her mother's safety the moment the first Vorak warrior's boots hit the pavement. Her voice didn't even tremble, just carried that particular pitch of childhood concern that cuts through ambient noise. The question wasn't, "What are you going to do to me?" or "Are you going to kill us?" It was, "Where's my mom? Is she okay?" This wasn't in any Vorak psychological warfare manual. Commander Vex engaged her directly, lowering himself to her eye level in what his training suggested was a dominance display modification. He described the horrors to come with calm menace, his vocal modifiers adjusting to create that specific frequency that typically induced paralytic fear in most species. His dialogue followed established protocols designed to maximize psychological torture, detailed descriptions of pain, explicit timelines of suffering, and that classic Vorak touch, making loved ones witness the agony. "I'm going to hurt you," he told her, his faceplate reflecting her dusty overalls, "and I'm going to make sure she watches every moment." This performance was meant to be broadcast across human colonies as the ultimate deterrent. The Vorak had set up 17 different recording angles, audio enhancers, and even emotional resonance scanners to capture the perfect fear response. Their propaganda teams waited to edit the footage into 30-second spots that would play on colonial networks. They anticipated this would become their masterpiece of psychological warfare, the moment a human child's broken spirit convinced an entire species to surrender. But Emma's fear triggered something deeper in the watching colonists than the Vorak anticipated. Her simple question, "Are you going to hurt my mommy?" exposed the personal nature of the threat in a way that abstract concepts of imperial domination never could. It wasn't about territory or resources anymore. It became about a specific mother baking bread 2 blocks away, about the chocolate cake she'd promised to make for dessert, about the bedtime story she told every night. The colonists watching through hidden cameras didn't see an abstract demonstration of power. They saw a little girl worried about her. Mom thought Emma's innocent response turned the Vorak's psychological warfare against them. Their carefully staged production suddenly looked less like a demonstration of strength and more like a group of armored adults threatening a child over a jump rope. The emotional resonance scanners picked up something unexpected, not fear spreading through the human population, but something sharper, hotter, and more dangerous. At the time, nobody realized this child had just become the spark for galactic change, her question echoing across comm channels that were supposed to be broadcasting surrender, but instead carried a very different message. "Look, retired soldiers often try to leave war behind. Sterling just buried it under farmland. He'd been colonial Marines for 27 years, fought in 7 major campaigns, and commanded rapid response teams across 3 sectors. Then he bought 12 hectares on Haven's Rest and planted soybeans. Nobody knew about the commendations gathering dust in a locked crate under his bed. They just saw a quiet man who fixed irrigation systems and didn't talk much at community meetings. David Sterling moved through Haven's Rest with a dangerous stillness that went completely unnoticed. His PTSD manifested as hyper-awareness rather than jumpiness. He noticed every failing door hinge, every flickering light, every child's misplaced toy that might become a tripping hazard. The colonists misinterpreted this constant environmental scanning as simple attentiveness. They'd see him pause to watch birds taking flight or adjust a loose fence, post and think, "What a careful farmer," rather than, "What a trained observer assessing threat vectors." His expertise included intimate knowledge of Vorak tactical patterns from previous engagements. He'd fought them at the Battle of Cygnus Gorge, where their armored divisions fell for the same feint 3 times consecutively. He knew about the 0.8-second targeting delay in their standard-issue plasma rifles, the time between trigger squeeze and actual energy discharge. He'd studied their armor joints, knew exactly which angles would bypass the chest plating, which vulnerable points their own design overlooked. This wasn't theoretical knowledge either. He'd field-tested every weakness personally. The Vorak intelligence assessment assumed they faced untrained civilians, not a seasoned strategist who'd written their tactical manuals against his will during 6 months of captivity. Their scouts reported agricultural workers, teachers, mechanics, standard frontier colony demographics. They missed the quiet man who walked the perimeter every evening, noting sightlines and choke points, whose farming equipment included signal, intercept gear, and molecular bonding adhesives that could seal hull breaches or immobilize armored limbs. Sterling's moral imperative was purely protective, defend the colony at any cost. He hadn't joined the militia or taken any official security role. He just made sure the emergency bunkers had redundant air filters and the comms tower had backup power that didn't show on any schematics. His defense philosophy centered on making the colony unappealing to attack rather than fortified against assault. He calculated that appearing vulnerable was better than appearing prepared. Then the first shuttle dropped, and Sterling's war instincts reactivated without conscious thought. He was checking irrigation lines when the shadow passed over him. His body went through the threat assessment sequence before his mind registered the sound. Posture adjustment, environmental scan, weapon identification, civilian status evaluation. He didn't panic or freeze. He just started moving toward the plaza with that economical gait that used to make his Marines nervous. His hidden skill set became the colony's unexpected defense system at the exact moment Commander Vex was explaining to a child how he planned to torture her. The farmer vanished and the soldier took his place. Superior technology means nothing against precise knowledge of its weaknesses. The Vorak arrived with plasma rifles that could melt through armor plating and personal shields that could deflect artillery fire. Sterling had a farmer's multi-tool, 3 lengths of irrigation piping, and the emergency hydraulic jack from his ground car. The technological disparity should have been laughable. Instead, it became a case study in how experience trumps equipment every time. Sterling engaged 36 Vorak warriors in the town plaza, using only salvaged equipment. He didn't charge in shouting or make dramatic declarations. He simply moved from one piece of cover to another, market stalls, decorative planters, the community bulletin board, collecting useful items as he went. The Vorak expected submission. They received coordinated lethal force. Their helmet displays registered him as a low priority, civilian threat until he disabled. Their point guard with a precise strike to the neck. Joint using a sharpened trowel exploited the 0.8-second targeting. Delay in their energy weapons. That hesitation, less time than it takes to blink, became his primary weapon. He'd step into sight, let them acquire target lock, then move before the plasma discharge occurred. Their shots consistently hit where he'd been standing moments earlier. They kept adjusting their aim predictions, but he never followed predictable patterns. His movements were those of someone who'd spent years learning how Vorak targeting algorithms worked under combat stress. He struck armor joints at specific angles where plating was thinnest. The multi-tool became a precision instrument, not for cutting irrigation lines, but for finding the microscopic gaps between ceramic plates. He'd apply pressure at exact points that leveraged armor against itself, popping sections loose like opening canned goods. The hydraulic jack, meant for lifting stranded vehicles, became a makeshift battering ram that shattered knee joints when applied with proper technique. Each movement was efficient and economical. No wasted motion, no theatrical flourishes, just pure mechanical effectiveness. The Vorak formation collapsed within moments from precise strikes. They were trained for standoff engagements and suppression fire, not close-quarters combat against someone who knew their equipment better than they did. Their overwhelming firepower became useless against tactics that kept them constantly off balance. Sterling moved through them like water finding cracks in a dam, always flowing toward the weakest points, exploiting every hesitation, every moment of confusion. Their command structure broke down as junior warriors waited for orders that never came. Officers focused on maintaining the propaganda broadcast instead of tactical coordination. They were so committed to the performance aspect of the operation that they forgot they were actually in a fight. Sterling took advantage of their distraction, disabling communication gear and creating pockets of isolated soldiers who couldn't coordinate their responses. Sterling's combat experience turned their technological advantage into a liability. Their heavy armor became cumbersome weight that slowed their reactions. Their enhanced optics provided too much data, causing targeting confusion at close range. Their networked systems became vulnerability points when he started taking out their communication relays. But this was only the first layer of Haven's Rest's deception. The Vorak were so focused on the farmer dismantling their squad that they failed to notice the empty windows, the silent streets, the complete absence of any other human presence in what was supposed to be a populated town center. The thing about humans is they'll dig in rather than give up. When faced with overwhelming force, their first instinct isn't to surrender valuable territory. It's to burrow into it like cosmic moles with a pathological aversion to relocation. Haven's Rest had evacuated its entire population into hidden mountain bunkers weeks before the Vorak arrival, transforming what looked like a vulnerable farming community into the galaxy's most elaborate empty set. The surface settlement was nothing but holograms, biomimetic materials, and automated systems running on timers. Lights turned on and off in patterns that suggested domestic routines. Irrigation systems watered decorative plants nobody would ever harvest. Automated bakery ovens produced bread that would be eaten by recycling drones. It was theater for an audience that never questioned whether the actors were actually there. Orbital sensors detected convincing life signs because of sophisticated deception protocols developed specifically for frontier colonies. The systems emitted thermal signatures matching human body heat, biochemical traces consistent with human metabolism, even the subtle energy fluctuations of household electronics. The Vorak scan teams reported confirming a population of 3,127 beings, completely missing that they were counting cleverly programmed emitters rather than actual people. Their sensors picked up what they expected to find: the comforting pattern of civilian life completely unaware of impending doom. The bunker system contained 6 months of supplies, defensive weapons and communications equipment hardened against orbital scanning. This wasn't just shelter. It was a forward operating base in disguise, complete with manufacturing capabilities for ammunition and repair parts. The colonists could have sustained themselves indefinitely, while coordinating resistance operations across the entire continent. They had medical facilities, educational spaces for children, even recreational areas, all buried under 300 meters of granite with 17 separate concealed exits. Colonists practiced evacuation drills regularly without Vorak detection. They treated them like community events, bunker days where everyone would bring snacks and games while testing systems and practicing emergency procedures. Children knew evacuation routes better than they knew multiplication tables. Adults could disassemble and reassemble air filtration systems blindfolded. The drills were so integrated into daily life the Vorak intelligence analyst monitoring communications. Traffic dismissed them as quirky cultural traditions rather than military preparations. The deception required perfect coordination and timing. When the alert came, everyone moved with practiced efficiency, closing down systems, activating decoys, and disappearing into the mountain within 17 minutes. They left behind just enough activity to maintain the illusion. A few automated ground vehicles moving between buildings, climate control systems maintaining interior temperatures, even music playing from public speakers. The Vorak were bombing a ghost town while the real colony watched safely from underground, monitoring everything through hidden sensors and preparing their next moves, which made their orbital bombardment the perfect distraction, consuming resources and attention while the actual threat developed right under their sensor arrays. Look, torturing children rarely works out well for the torturer. Commander Vex believed Emma's terror would demoralize the entire human species. He'd seen the pattern work across 17 systems, show dominance over the most vulnerable and the rest fall in line. His psychological training emphasized breaking the weakest link to collapse the entire chain of resistance. The Vorak had whole departments dedicated to calculating precisely which demographic to target for maximum psychological impact. They'd run the numbers on human colonies and determine children represented the optimal pressure point. Instead, it galvanized every adult within viewing distance. The hidden cameras captured something Vex's instruments completely missed: the subtle shift in breathing patterns among the watching colonists, the way hands tightened around improvised weapons, the silent communication passing between people who moments earlier had been pretending to be terrified civilians. What Vex interpreted as successful fear induction was actually something much more dangerous: the physiological preparation for protective violence. Humans have this peculiar response where threat to young doesn't cause despair, but triggers what their psychologists call the guardian cascade. His calm narration of impending violence was meant to showcase Vorak control. He described slave markets with the detached precision of an auctioneer listing livestock specifications. He detailed breeding programs as if discussing agricultural optimization. His delivery was flawless, each word measured, each pause perfectly timed for maximum psychological impact. The Vorak communication specialist monitoring the broadcast praised his performance in real time, noting the excellent vocal modulation and masterful use of suspense-building techniques. They were so focused on the quality of the production, they missed the content's actual effect on the audience. The broadcast was supposed to demonstrate invincible dominance. Vorak Command expected human colonies to watch and calculate the odds of resistance being worth the certain retaliation. Their entire doctrine assumed rational actors making cost-benefit analyses based on demonstrated power disparities. They'd prepared follow-up transmissions showing the efficiency of their processing systems and the opportunities available to compliant populations. The psychological operation was designed to make surrender appear not just necessary, but somehow advantageous. But humans watching saw something else. A child threatened by monsters. They didn't see advanced military technology or impressive organizational capabilities. They saw 8 armored adults surrounding a little girl holding a jump rope. They heard her asking about her mother while a deep voice described unimaginable horrors. The technical sophistication of the broadcast worked against the Vorak. High-definition footage meant every detail was visible, from the dust on Emma's overalls to the way her small hands tightened around the rope handles. Vex's expertise in psychological warfare worked perfectly on the wrong species. His techniques were calibrated for civilizations that respond to demonstrated power with pragmatic accommodation. He knew exactly how to make the Naxilians surrender without firing a shot, and how to make the Calarians abandon their defensive positions. Every syllable, every gesture, every calculated pause was textbook perfect Vorak psychological operations. The problem was humans don't follow the textbook. His threat to make Emma's mother watch backfired spectacularly. Where he intended to demonstrate ultimate control over family bonds, humans interpreted it as the deepest possible violation of their protective instincts. That single statement transformed the conflict from political to personal for every adult watching. Fathers saw their own daughters. Mothers imagined their own children. The abstract concept of Vorak oppression became suddenly painfully specific. Vex became the face of Vorak arrogance meeting human protectiveness. His image, leaning down to speak to a child while describing atrocities, became the iconic representation of everything wrong with the Empire's approach. The recording showed up on protest signs, morale patches, even children's drawings across human space. His professionally delivered threats became study material for human psychological warfare teams analyzing Vorak weaknesses. At the time, he didn't realize he was creating a martyr for resistance. He was too focused on his performance metrics, too pleased with the clean audio capture and perfect camera angles. The psychological sensors were reporting exactly what he wanted to see: elevated heart rates, increased cortisol levels, all the biological markers of successful fear induction. He completely missed the other readings, the adrenaline spikes, the muscle tension patterns indicating preparation for action, the neural activity associated with protective aggression. The tools measured fear perfectly but couldn't detect righteous anger. You know, when your demonstration fails, escalating usually makes it worse. Warlord Cathrix ordered full planetary bombardment immediately after the Plaza defeat, a decision driven entirely by saving face rather than strategic logic. The Vorak command wanted to turn the settlement to glass and erase the embarrassment of their elite warriors being dismantled by a farmer with hand tools. They assumed total destruction would eliminate evidence of their failure, creating a clean slate where they could rewrite the narrative of what happened in that plaza. In their culture, obliterating the problem physically meant solving it politically. They didn't consider that sometimes the evidence isn't in the rubble, it's in the transmissions that escape during the bombardment. This rage-driven response played directly into human plans they hadn't even detected yet. Bombing an empty settlement provided perfect cover for Sterling's next move, activating the emergency beacon hidden in the mountains. The sustained plasma barrage created such massive energy signatures that it masked the hyperspace distortion his transmission created. Their sensors were so overloaded with the theatrical display of firepower that they missed the critical data packet, slipping through their jamming fields. The Vorak were so focused on the spectacular destruction they were causing that they failed to notice they were essentially providing the perfect smokescreen for their own undoing. The bombardment triggered hyperspace alarms they hadn't anticipated because they'd underestimated human communication networks. Haven's Rest hadn't been broadcasting just agricultural reports. It had been maintaining constant diagnostic pings to colonial monitoring stations. When those pings suddenly stopped amid massive energy spikes, it tripped every alert protocol across the sector. The Vorak assumed they were dealing with an isolated colony, not realizing it was a node in a larger network that would immediately notice its abrupt disappearance. Their intelligence had missed the simple fact that humans maintain connections even when they appear isolated. Their ships became exposed and vulnerable during firing sequences. Plasma bombardment requires energy weapon systems to divert power from shields and maneuvering thrusters. For approximately 13 seconds during each firing cycle, their command ship's defensive capabilities dropped to minimum levels. This was standard procedure they'd used for centuries without issue, because typically nobody shoots back during an orbital bombardment. They'd become so accustomed to unilateral destruction that they'd forgotten basic fleet defense protocols during offensive operations. The window was narrow but consistent, and exactly what Sterling's transmission had detailed to incoming human forces. The Vorak's theatrical approach to warfare became their undoing. They were so committed to the spectacle of turning a settlement to glass that they failed to maintain proper defensive formations. Ships clustered together for better visual effect of simultaneous bombardment, creating ideal targeting solutions for anyone responding to the distress call. Their formation looked impressive from the surface, a coordinated display of overwhelming force. From tactical perspective, it was a shooting gallery waiting for someone to show up with the right ammunition. Then the real human forces arrived precisely during the third bombardment cycle, when shield capacitors were drained and weapon systems were cycling for another volley. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was calculation based on the data Sterling had provided about Vorak operational patterns. The Retribution dropped out of hyperspace not as a Mongmu response to aggression, but as a surgical instrument following very specific instructions about when and where to strike. The thing about human commanders is they understand moral mathematics. Commander Sarah Voss received Sterling's transmission aboard the Retribution just as the orbital bombardment commenced. She watched the feed from Haven's Rest, the farmer dismantling Vorak warriors, the child being threatened, the plasma fire beginning to scorch the empty settlement. Her sensors showed a Vorak battle group of 12 capital ships against her single cruiser. The tactical display recommended immediate retreat, highlighting the overwhelming firepower disparity and low probability of successful engagement. She faced a choice that would define human military doctrine for generations: retreat or engage a superior. Vorak fleet. Protocol demanded disengagement. Preserve the ship, report the intelligence, let command decide the response. Every standard operating procedure, every tactical manual, every reasonable calculation said to withdraw and live to fight another day. The Vorak had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy entire settlements. Engaging them now risked losing the Retribution and its critical intelligence. Her now famous line calculated the moral equation that overrode all tactical considerations. They just murdered 3,000 civilians, including children. This became the casus belli that justified extreme retaliation beyond standard rules of engagement. She wasn't just counting casualties. She was measuring the moral cost of inaction against the strategic risk of action. The calculation wasn't about victory, probabilities, but about what kind of species humans would be if they allowed this to stand unanswered. Voss ordered quantum torpedoes, targeted at Vorak command ships with specific firing solutions. She bypassed the usual target selection protocols, aiming not for maximum destruction but for maximum leadership disruption. Her strategy focused on disabling their command structure rather than destroying everything. The torpedoes were programmed to strike bridge modules, communications arrays, and engineering sections, the neural network of the Vorak fleet. This wasn't about annihilation. It was about surgical removal of command capability. The Retribution's attack was swift, precise, and utterly devastating. It emerged from hyperspace during the Vorak's bombardment cycle, when their shields were weakest and targeting systems were recalibrating. The quantum torpedoes found their marks before the Vorak even registered the new threat. Command ships began losing power and coordination while their weapons were still aimed at the planet below. The Retribution moved through the formation like a scalpel through tissue, separating capabilities from vessels without unnecessary destruction. Voss redefined human warfare as morally justified precision strikes rather than overwhelming force. She demonstrated that military response could be both proportional and devastating, that protecting the innocent didn't require becoming monsters ourselves. Her engagement protocol became the new standard. Minimum necessary force applied with maximum precision against specifically culpable targets. This wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing clear consequences for crossing moral boundaries. But the real victory was in what Sterling had already transmitted before the shooting started. The tactical data streaming from Haven's Rest gave Voss the exact vulnerabilities to exploit. Shield frequencies, command structure patterns, even the personal combat styles of individual Vorak captains. She knew which ships would break formation under pressure and which would hold. She understood their communication protocols well enough to anticipate their responses. The battle was decided before the first torpedo launched, because the farmer had already given her the playbook to their entire military doctrine. Look, sometimes the most valuable weapon is information about your enemy's weaknesses. Sterling used salvaged Vorak equipment to transmit tactical data to the Retribution, bypassing their jamming fields by exploiting a maintenance frequency they'd left unsecured. This wasn't just battle footage. It was the most comprehensive Vorak dossier ever obtained, packed with specifications and protocols that intelligence agencies had been trying to acquire for decades. He'd managed to access their tactical network through a damaged helmet's backup transmitter, streaming real-time combat data alongside archived training manuals and technical schematics. The transmission included weapon specifications, armor schematics, and command protocols that revealed systemic vulnerabilities. Detailed diagrams showed exactly where to strike plasma rifles to cause catastrophic failure without triggering safeties. Armor schematics highlighted the microscopic gaps between abdominal plates that could be exploited with minimal force. Command protocols laid bare the precise chain of command dependencies that would collapse if specific officers were removed from the equation. It was like receiving the complete technical manual for your enemy's entire military infrastructure. Voss's crew analyzed every frame of the plaza engagement for vulnerabilities they could exploit immediately. They noticed how the Vorak warriors consistently hesitated when their primary target moved in specific patterns, revealing a flaw in their motion prediction algorithms. They documented the exact second it took for helmet displays to recalibrate after bright flashes, creating windows of opportunity. They even identified the subtle postural adjustments that indicated when a warrior was about to request command guidance versus acting independently. They discovered pattern recognition flaws in Vorak targeting systems that made them predictable in combat situations. The systems consistently over-prioritized center mass targeting, even when limbs presented greater threats, a holdover from their evolutionary history fighting larger creatures. Their sensors also had a documented delay in processing rapid vertical movement, something human combatants had never thought to exploit, because it seemed too basic to matter. These weren't software bugs, but fundamental design limitations baked into their technology. The data revealed psychological weaknesses in Vorak chain of command that went deeper than tactical limitations. Junior officers showed excessive reliance on predefined protocols rather than adaptive thinking. Unit cohesion fractured dramatically when communication with command vessels was interrupted for more than 47 seconds. There was even evidence of status anxiety influencing tactical decisions. Officers would take unnecessary risks to appear aggressive in front of superiors. This intelligence would shape human defense strategies for decades, becoming the foundation of every colonial security protocol. Military academies developed entirely new curricula based on the transmission's insights, teaching cadets how to leverage Vorak technological strengths against their psychological limitations. Civilian defense planning incorporated the timing windows and pattern vulnerabilities into emergency response training. The data became so valuable that security agencies developed multiple, redundant methods for protecting it while still making it accessible to frontline defenders. Sterling's risk provided unprecedented insight into Vorak capabilities that transformed the conflict from desperate defense to calculated engagement. His transmission gave human forces the equivalent of reading their opponent's playbook, while simultaneously understanding exactly why they called specific plays. The information didn't just show what the Vorak could do, it explained why they did it that way, revealing cultural and psychological drivers behind their military doctrine, which brought us to the most embarrassing part for the Vorak. Their own technology, captured and repurposed by a retired soldier, had delivered the keys to their defeat directly to their enemies. The very systems they considered superior became the conduit for their tactical undoing. Their assumption of technological invincibility created the blind spot that allowed a farmer with salvaged gear to compromise their entire military infrastructure. You know, empires built on fear collapse quickly when someone isn't afraid. The Haven's Rest incident became instant legend across human and Vorak space within weeks of the battle. The footage spread through unofficial channels, traders sharing data chips, maintenance crews passing files during refueling stops, even children trading clips like collector's cards. What the Vorak intended as a demonstration of power became instead the most widely distributed tutorial on how to defeat them. Every species in the sector suddenly had access to visual evidence that their overlords weren't invincible, just well-armed bullies who folded when confronted properly. Vorak raids against human colonies plummeted within months of the incident. Their military command quietly redirected resources away from human space, focusing instead on less problematic targets. The change wasn't announced publicly, just a gradual withdrawal that frontier colonies noticed when patrols stopped appearing and border sensors went unnervingly quiet. The Vorak weren't admitting defeat. They were recalculating risk assessments based on new data about human response patterns. Their entire expansion model depended on predictable cost-benefit analyses, and humans had suddenly become mathematically problematic. Their military morale flagged as soldiers realized human resistance was effective rather than symbolic. Frontline troops who'd once operated with confident swagger began questioning tactical orders, especially those involving direct engagement with human settlements. The informal networks that connecting military bases across Vorak space buzzed with speculation about what really happened at Haven's Rest. Soldiers shared embellished versions of the story, how a single farmer defeated an entire battalion, how a child's question broke their commander's psychological conditioning, how human ships emerged from nowhere to dismantle their fleet. The legend grew with each retelling, always emphasizing Vorak vulnerability. Diplomatic channels reopened for the first time in generations, though neither side acknowledged why. Human diplomats received formal invitations to negotiation tables they hadn't been allowed to approach in decades. The discussions focused on trade agreements and territorial boundaries, carefully avoiding any mention of military engagements or recent conflicts. The Vorak approached these talks with uncharacteristic caution, their representatives displaying none of the arrogant posturing that had characterized previous interactions. They'd learned that humans negotiated better when they weren't being threatened. The Vorak propaganda machine couldn't erase the footage of their defeat despite considerable effort. Their information control specialists attempted to flood networks with counter-narratives, claims of human atrocities, fabricated victories, even altered footage showing Vorak triumphs. None of it gained traction because the original recording had already achieved critical mass. The visual of a farmer dismantling armored warriors with hand tools was simply too compelling to overwrite with conventional propaganda. Their attempts at damage control only made them look more desperate. Other species began questioning Vorak dominance openly in council meetings and trade negotiations. Minor civilizations that had accepted Vorak authority for generations started testing boundaries, delaying tribute payments, challenging inspection rights, even forming mutual defense pacts without Vorak approval. The change wasn't dramatic rebellion but gradual erosion of compliance. They'd seen the foundation of fear crack and recognized they could push against it without immediate retaliation. The Vorak found themselves constantly responding to small challenges instead of initiating demands. Within a year, even Vorak officers doubted their invincibility despite official denials. Training academies reported cadets questioning tactical doctrines that had been unquestioned for centuries. Field commanders began requesting excessive reinforcements for operations that previously required minimal force. The institutional confidence that had propelled their expansion evaporated, replaced by cautious calculations and risk-averse decision-making. They still possessed the same weapons and ships, but they'd lost the psychological certainty that had made them effective. The demonstration meant to terrorize humans instead dismantled Vorak credibility across the sector. Their reputation shifted from fearsome conquerors to cautious administrators, struggling to maintain control. The empire didn't collapse in a single dramatic event, but through countless small adjustments as every species recalculated their relationship with the once dominant power. But the personal stories continued evolving beyond the military and political consequences, taking on lives of their own in unexpected directions. The thing about childhood trauma is it either breaks you or defines your life's work. Emma Valdez grew up studying the species that tried to harm her, turning personal terror into professional expertise, with a focus that would make most therapists concerned and all academics impressed. She didn't just move past the incident in the plaza, she dissected it, analyzed it, and built her entire career around understanding why it happened. Her childhood curiosity about fear and defense mechanisms became a scientific pursuit that eventually earned her degrees in xenobiology and interspecies psychology. She specialized in arthropod-based alien species specifically because their biological structures shared disturbing similarities with Vorak anatomy. While other students studied elegant avian species or fascinating aquatic life forms, Emma spent her university years elbow-deep in the behavioral patterns of creatures with exoskeletons and compound eyes. Her professors found her research direction unsettlingly specific, but couldn't argue with her results. She understood Vorak sensory processing better than most Vorak did, mapping their visual spectrum limitations and auditory perception gaps with clinical precision. Her groundbreaking dissertation analyzed behavioral patterns in hierarchical military structures across 3 arthropod-based species, including the Vorak. The paper became required reading at military academies despite its dry academic tone, because it revealed something nobody had documented before: how rigid command structures create predictable psychological vulnerabilities. She demonstrated that highly hierarchical species develop specific stress responses when their chain of command is disrupted, and how this could be leveraged without violence. Emma's work directly helped develop psychological countermeasures against Vorak tactics that are still in use today. Her research identified the precise verbal patterns that caused confusion in Vorak communications and the specific environmental factors that reduced their combat effectiveness. She discovered that certain frequency ranges disrupted their group coordination without causing physical harm, and that particular color patterns could induce hesitation in their targeting systems. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense, they were behavioral tools that made conflict unnecessary. She transformed the personal terror of standing before armored conquerors into professional expertise that protected entire colonies. The child who had once faced down Commander Vex with a jump rope now advised diplomatic teams on how to negotiate with Vorak representatives. Her insights helped develop communication protocols that prevented misunderstandings from escalating into violence. She never sought revenge through her work, just understanding, and through understanding, prevention. Her research contributed significantly to diplomatic approaches with former enemies by providing a framework for interspecies communication that accounted for fundamental psychological differences. She showed how Vorak perception of time influenced their negotiating styles and how their visual processing affected their interpretation of body language. Diplomats began using her techniques to avoid accidental provocations and build trust through carefully calibrated interactions. The child who witnessed horror became an expert in understanding it, not as an abstract concept but as a biological and psychological phenomenon that could be measured, analyzed, and ultimately mitigated. She published 17 papers on stress responses in predator species and developed 3 new protocols for de-escalating interspecies conflicts. Her work became the foundation of modern first contact procedures, ensuring that no other child would have to face what she faced without systems in place to prevent it. Meanwhile, Sterling was creating something equally unexpected back on Haven's Rest, though from a completely different perspective. While Emma studied psychological patterns in laboratories, Sterling was building practical solutions in farm fields, both approaches stemming from the same traumatic event, but developing along parallel paths that would eventually reshape human defensive capabilities across the frontier. Look, sometimes the best way to win wars is to prevent them through preparation. David Sterling returned to farming after the Vorak incident, but launched the Haven's Rest Colonial Defense Institute right there among the soybean fields. He didn't build some gleaming military academy, just repurposed a storage barn and started teaching practical problem-solving and improvised field maintenance to anyone who showed up. The sign outside still said agricultural solutions because, technically, That's what he was providing, solutions to the agricultural problem of your farm being invaded by hostile aliens. His institute taught civilian resilience rather than military aggression through what appeared to be ordinary farming workshops. He'd demonstrate how irrigation systems could be modified to create perimeter defenses, how fertilizer components could be repurposed for emergency repairs, how common farming tools could disable advanced armor. The curriculum focused on making colonists harder targets rather than better soldiers. Sterling understood that the best defense wasn't counterattack. It was making attack too complicated to be worth attempting. He transformed his combat experience into community protection, strategies that leveraged everyday resources. Workshops covered everything from emergency evacuation protocols to basic field medicine, using agricultural supplies. He taught colonists how to identify natural choke points in their settlements, how to establish communication networks using existing infrastructure, how to create early warning systems from spare parts. The training integrated seamlessly into daily life because it used tools and materials colonists already understood. His teachings emphasized vulnerability, exploitation, and strategic deception rather than direct confrontation. He'd demonstrate how to identify weaknesses in enemy equipment, using nothing but observation and basic logic. Colonists learned how to create convincing decoys, how to mask their actual numbers, how to use environmental factors to their advantage. The approach was always defensive, how to make your community appear too troublesome to bother with rather than how to defeat invaders in battle. The Institute became a model for frontier colony defense across human space because it worked with available resources, rather than requiring military support. Other colonies adopted Sterling's methods, adapting them to their specific environments and threats. Mining colonies developed techniques using mining equipment. Orbital stations created protocols using life support systems. Aquatic settlements devised defenses using marine technology. The common thread was always leveraging what you already had, rather than waiting for external protection. Sterling refused to glorify violence, focusing instead on prevention and protection. His lectures emphasized minimizing conflict rather than winning battles. He'd tell students the best fight is the one that never happens because the other side calculated it wasn't worth starting. This philosophy resonated with frontier communities that valued self-reliance but didn't romanticize warfare. They wanted to protect their homes, not become soldiers. His legacy became teaching others how to avoid fighting his kind of war. The Institute's graduates spread across human space, carrying Sterling's principles of strategic preparation and non-escalation. They established similar programs on dozens of worlds, each adapted to local conditions but maintaining the core philosophy that defense should be integrated into daily life rather than being a separate military function. The approach fundamentally changed how human colonies perceived security, not as something provided by external forces, but as something built into their communities from the ground up. But one key Vorak figure remained to tell their side of the story, providing the missing perspective that would complete the historical record. Commander Vex's captivity offered insights that even Sterling's brilliant analysis couldn't provide. The internal view of how the Vorak command structure actually perceived the events at Haven's Rest and how that single engagement shattered their confidence in their entire military doctrine. Sometimes the defeated learn more than the victors. Commander Vex spent years in human custody providing intelligence that reshaped interspecies understanding from both directions. His captivity wasn't the brutal confinement the Vorak expected. Humans gave him books, conversation, even access to their cultural archives. They treated him like a difficult guest rather than a prisoner of war, which confused him more than torture would have. This approach forced him to confront his own cultural assumptions about weakness and strength, captivity and honor, in ways that physical punishment never could achieve. His insights came from systematically dismantling everything he'd been taught about human nature. He'd sit for hours comparing Vorak military doctrine with actual human behavior patterns, finding discrepancies that explained why their psychological operations kept failing. He realized they'd been interpreting human compassion as vulnerability, community bonds as structural weaknesses, protective instincts as emotional liabilities. The Vorak had built their entire expansion model on fundamental misreadings of basic human psychology. Vex eventually wrote a memoir titled, What Humans Don't Want You to Know during his later years of captivity. The book wasn't confession or apology, but cold analysis of Vorak's strategic failures. He documented how their intelligence gathering missed critical cultural context, how their psychological profiling ignored evolutionary drivers, how their military planning underestimated adaptive capabilities. He wrote with the dispassionate tone of a scientist reviewing flawed, experimental design rather than a defeated soldier making excuses. The book became required reading in Vorak military academies as a cautionary tale about cultural arrogance. Young officers studied it not as enemy propaganda but as their own operational autopsy. Training exercises incorporated his findings into scenario planning, forcing cadets to confront how traditional Vorak tactics would fail against species with different psychological frameworks. The military establishment hated admitting an outsider understood them better than they understood themselves. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore. He detailed the human protective instinct as their greatest strategic weapon, something Vorak analysts had consistently categorized as an emotional vulnerability. His analysis showed how this drive created coordination without command structure, sacrifice without coercion, innovation without central planning. He demonstrated that threatening human young didn't cause societal collapse but triggered what he called the unified response mechanism, a rapid, spontaneous coordination that bypassed normal decision-making channels. Vex's repatriation later became a diplomatic bridge between species when relations eventually thawed. His return wasn't celebrated as a hero's homecoming, but treated as an opportunity for mutual understanding. Both sides used his unique perspective to establish communication protocols that avoided the mistakes of first contact. He became a consultant rather than a commander, advising on intersectional psychology and conflict prevention. His transformation from conqueror to commentator surprised everyone, especially himself. The officer who had once believed in overwhelming force now advocated for nuanced understanding. He gave lectures at interspecies conferences, wrote analytical papers for academic journals, even advised human diplomatic teams on Vorak cultural sensitivities. His credibility came from having been wrong in very specific, well-documented ways that others could learn from. The face of Vorak terror became the voice of understanding humanity, his image evolving from threatening figure to thoughtful analyst. The same visual recordings that once symbolized Vorak aggression now served as teaching tools about intercultural misunderstanding. His calm narration of intended torture became case study material for psychology students analyzing how communication fails across species lines. Meanwhile, Warlord Cathrix became a different kind of lesson entirely, the cautionary example of what happened when you refuse to learn from your mistakes. Where Vex adapted and evolved, Cathrix represented the inflexible thinking that ultimately destroyed Vorak dominance. Their contrasting legacies demonstrated that defeat itself wasn't the problem. The failure to understand why you were defeated was what ultimately mattered. The thing about underestimating humans is they remember who did it. Warlord Cathrix's ship was destroyed by the Retribution's quantum torpedoes during the third bombardment cycle, precisely when his shields were cycling and targeting systems were realigning for another volley. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes from the first torpedo impact to the final energy cascade that tore his command vessel apart. His death became instant legend across both human and Vorak space, though for entirely different reasons. Humans celebrated it as justice delivered. Vorak commanders studied it as catastrophic failure analyzed. Cathrix's epitaph served as permanent warning about human protective instincts and their willingness to escalate beyond expected parameters. His name became shorthand for catastrophic military overconfidence in both languages, a verb in Vorak military slang meaning to lose everything through arrogance, and a noun in human tactical discussions, meaning the moment your opponent stops following your script. His legacy wasn't just a single defeat, but the demonstration that human response calculations included variables the Vorak had never considered. Vorak commanders studied his mistakes for generations, incorporating them into training scenarios and strategic planning. Academy cadets analyzed the Haven's rest engagement from multiple angles, identifying 17 distinct points where different decisions could have altered the outcome. They learned about proper threat assessment, intelligence verification, and the dangers of allowing theatrical objectives to override tactical considerations. Cathrix's name appeared in textbooks not as a hero but as a case study in command failure. The destruction of his fleet demonstrated human willingness to escalate conflict in ways that defied conventional military logic. Where most species would have calculated the odds and withdrawn, humans responded to the threat against their young with disproportionate force that made no strategic sense until you understood their psychological drivers. The Vorak learned too late that humans don't fight for territory or resources alone. They fight for principles, and once engaged, they don't follow predictable escalation patterns. Cathrix's legacy was being the example others learned to avoid. His name invoked whenever commanders considered aggressive actions against human interests. His miscalculation ended not just his life, but Vorak dominance by shattering the illusion of their invincibility. The Empire didn't collapse immediately, but the certainty that had driven their expansion evaporated overnight. Other species watched how humans responded and recalculated their own positions. Accordingly, the incident revealed that human colonies possessed unexpected resilience and strategic deception capabilities that made them far more dangerous than their technological level suggested. The Vorak Empire's carefully constructed image of invincibility was irrevocably damaged by the events at Haven's Rest, demonstrating that even the most powerful empires could be vulnerable to a combination of courage, ingenuity, and fierce protective instincts. His fate became a permanent fixture in galactic military education, taught alongside other historic blunders as examples of cultural misunderstanding, leading to strategic disaster. The lesson wasn't just about human capabilities, but about the universal danger of assuming you understand another species' psychological triggers without actually understanding their evolutionary context and cultural values. Which brings us to how the galaxy remembered this event, not as a military engagement, but as a cultural turning point where one species' arrogance met another's protective fury, with consequences that reshaped diplomatic relations for generations. The memory proved impossible to erase because it revealed fundamental truths about interspecies conflict that applied far beyond this single encounter. Look, propaganda machines can't erase footage that everyone has seen. The Vorak Empire tried to suppress the Haven's Rest incident through every conventional method, jamming signals, confiscating data chips, even threatening traitors who circulated the recording. Their information control specialists worked overtime, creating counter-narratives and altered footage showing Vorak triumphs. None of it mattered, because Sterling's transmission had already achieved critical mass across colonial networks. The visual evidence was simply too compelling to overwrite with fabricated victories. Their attempts failed because the transmission went viral through unofficial channels that bypassed their control systems. Traders shared data chips during refueling stops. Maintenance crews passed files between shifts. Colonists exchanged clips through personal communication devices. The footage spread like biological contamination through environmental systems, impossible to contain once it reached critical distribution points. The Vorak discovered too late that controlling information requires controlling curiosity, and humans possess that particular trait in dangerous abundance. The galaxy adjusted its behavior based on what happened at Haven's Rest, without any official declarations or policy changes. Species that had accepted Vorak dominance for generations started testing boundaries in small ways, delaying tribute, payments, challenging inspection rights, forming mutual defense pacts without approval. The change wasn't dramatic rebellion but gradual erosion of compliance as everyone recalculated the actual risks of resistance. They'd seen the foundation of fear crack and recognized they could push against it. Human colonies became known for unexpected resilience and deception rather than military strength. Other species started referring to Haven's Rest scenarios when discussing defensive planning, the idea that apparent vulnerability might conceal unexpected capabilities. Colonial architects incorporated strategic deception into settlement, designs creating hidden shelters and disguised infrastructure. The entire approach to frontier security shifted from fortification to misdirection based on what one agricultural colony had accomplished. The rebuilt world, New Haven, featured children playing in secure squares designed with layered defensive systems. The central plaza where Emma stood became a protected space with emergency shelters hidden beneath decorative fountains and communication gear integrated into playground equipment. Parents didn't keep children indoors. They built environments where they could play safely while remaining prepared. The visual of children playing where armor had once stood became the ultimate symbol of resilience. Adults understood some lines shouldn't be crossed regardless of consequences. The incident established that human protective instincts would override rational calculation when certain boundaries were violated. This wasn't formal policy, but cultural understanding that spread through colonial networks. Everyone knew that threatening children would trigger responses that made no strategic sense, but would be devastatingly effective. This understanding shaped interactions with other species more effectively than any treaty. The memory served as both warning and hope across species, cautionary tale and inspirational story simultaneously. Younger species learned about calculated risk assessment from Vorak mistakes, while finding encouragement in the idea that overwhelming force could be countered with ingenuity. The story contained elements that resonated across cultural boundaries: protection of young, cleverness overcoming strength, the underdog prevailing against impossible odds. Haven's Rest became impossible to erase because it revealed universal truths about power and vulnerability. It demonstrated that intimidation relies on perception rather than reality, that technological superiority means little against understanding, and that some psychological triggers transcend species boundaries. The recording wasn't just a battle footage, it was a lesson in fundamental interspecies dynamics that applied far beyond this single conflict. But the final lesson was even simpler, something that would reshape galactic relations for generations. The aftermath showed that human responses followed patterns that other species needed to understand, patterns rooted in biological imperatives rather than political calculations. This understanding would eventually lead to more stable interactions. But first, everyone had to absorb what really happened when you threatened human young, and why the consequences were so predictably devastating. Humans might forgive eventually, but they never forget. The Haven's Rest incident demonstrated human capacity for holding grudges in ways that most species find psychologically fascinating and strategically terrifying. Their memory for offenses isn't just emotional, it's methodical, cataloged, and strategically utilized across generations. Where other species might let historical conflicts fade into cultural memory, humans maintain detailed records, analyze patterns, and adjust their behavior based on lessons learned decades or even centuries earlier. This became a strategic advantage in galactic relations that nobody anticipated. Diplomatic teams began factoring human long memory into negotiation strategies, recognizing that concessions made today would be remembered and leveraged decades later. Trade agreements included clauses accounting for historical precedents that other species would have considered ancient history. Military planners studied conflicts from generations back to predict current human responses. The human ability to hold grudges transformed from social curiosity into geopolitical fact. Other species learned that harming humans had long-term consequences that extended beyond immediate retaliation. An attack on a human colony today might influence diplomatic relations 50 years later, when the children of victims became policymakers. Economic sanctions might be lifted officially, while individual businesses maintained embargoes based on historical grievances. The realization slowly dawned that human decision-making incorporated temporal dimensions most species didn't factor into their calculations. Human resilience was rooted in emotional memory and protective instincts that operated on generational timescales. Their children learned about historical conflicts not as abstract lessons, but as family stories with direct relevance to current relationships. Grandparents described events they'd witnessed firsthand, creating living connections to past injustices that remained emotionally immediate rather than academically distant. This intergenerational transmission of experience created cultural continuity that outsiders frequently underestimated. This psychological trait shaped diplomatic and military approaches across the sector. Negotiations with human representatives required understanding historical context that other species considered irrelevant. Military engagements had to account for the possibility that humans would pursue objectives that made no tactical sense but perfect historical sense. avenging old wrongs, protecting symbolic locations, or fulfilling promises made generations earlier. The temporal dimension of human strategy added complexity that conventional military doctrine didn't address. The Vorak learned too late that humans prioritize protection over practicality when certain boundaries are crossed. Their assumption about human rationality missed this core driver that overrides cost-benefit analysis. They expected humans to calculate the odds of successful resistance and act accordingly, not to fight hopeless battles out of principle or historical obligation. This miscalculation cost them their empire because they couldn't comprehend fighting for anything beyond measurable gains. Their intelligence assessments documented human economic patterns, technological capabilities, and military resources, but completely missed the cultural drivers that would override all practical considerations. They created detailed models of human behavior that accounted for every variable, except the most important one: the willingness to sacrifice immediate advantage for long-term principles. This blind spot meant they consistently misinterpreted human reactions as irrational rather than differently rational. Human long memory became their greatest deterrent against aggression because it created unpredictable but consistent response patterns. Other species never knew which actions would trigger historical parallels, or which apparently minor offenses would connect to deeper cultural narratives. This uncertainty made human space dangerous to operate in, not because of military strength, but because of psychological complexity. The safest approach became avoiding actions that might activate those long memories, which brings us to the final calculation that every species now makes when dealing with humans, not just assessing current capabilities but considering historical context, cultural memory, and the possibility that today's action might be remembered and responded to generations from now. The galaxy has learned that human diplomacy operates on multiple timelines simultaneously, making them simultaneously more predictable in their values and less predictable in their specific responses than any species that calculates only in the present. The thing about power dynamics is they change when someone rewrites the rules. Haven's Rest forced every species to reconsider human capabilities, not through technological displays or military parades, but through a demonstration that their psychological operating system worked differently than anyone had assumed. The galaxy had to update its understanding of what constituted strength, shifting from measurable firepower to unquantifiable resilience. This wasn't about who had the bigger guns, but about who understood how to use psychology as both shield and weapon. Galactic engagement rules now included human psychological factors as critical variables in any strategic calculation. Military planners started adding entirely new sections to their threat assessments, not just weapon ranges and ship counts, but cultural triggers, historical sensitivities, and protective instinct thresholds. They had to account for human deception capabilities that turned apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages. The standard Vorak approach of overwhelming force had been dismantled by misdirection and psychological understanding, proving that sometimes the best defense was making your opponent attack what wasn't actually there. Military strategies had to account for human protective instincts that could override rational calculations. Commanders learned that threatening human children created responses that followed different escalation patterns than conventional warfare models predicted. They began mapping what they called guardian response thresholds, the precise points where human defensive measures would shift from proportional to disproportionate based on perceived threats to their young. This required entirely new engagement protocols that avoided certain actions entirely rather than calculating acceptable casualty ratios. Diplomatic approaches incorporated human concepts of moral justification that other species had previously considered emotional weaknesses. Negotiations began accounting for historical grievances and principles that humans valued beyond immediate practical benefits. Other species learned that human diplomats would sometimes prioritize symbolic victories over material gains, and that agreements needed to satisfy both practical and philosophical considerations. This made negotiations more complex but also more stable once reached, because humans honored deals that aligned with their moral frameworks. The Vorak Empire's decline accelerated as their fear-based model failed against a species that responded to intimidation with innovation rather than submission. Their military morale suffered as soldiers realized human resistance was effective, and their command structure struggled to adapt to opponents who didn't follow predictable patterns. Other species watched the Vorak struggle and began recalculating their own positions, testing boundaries they would have never approached before. Haven's Rest. The Empire didn't collapse overnight, but gradually unraveled as confidence in their invincibility evaporated. Humanity's position shifted from vulnerable newcomer to respected power through demonstrated psychological strength rather than technological superiority. Other species began consulting human advisors on defensive planning and conflict resolution, recognizing they understood certain aspects of interspecies dynamics that others had missed. This respect wasn't granted out of fear, but earned through demonstrated competence in handling situations that had stumped traditional military thinkers. Humans became the experts in asymmetrical defense and psychological preparedness. This redefinition wasn't about technology, but psychological understanding that changed how everyone approached conflict. The galaxy learned that human resilience was their most valuable asset, not something that could be measured in ship counts or weapon yields, but in their capacity to endure, adapt, and remember. This understanding forced a recalibration of what actually constituted power in interspecies relations, moving beyond simple military comparisons to more nuanced assessments of cultural strengths and psychological capabilities. But the personal stories still needed closing. The individual arcs that transformed this strategic shift from abstract lesson to living history. The galaxy had absorbed the military and diplomatic implications, but the human participants in this drama were still living with the consequences of that day in the plaza, their lives permanently altered by choices made under extreme circumstances. Their stories would complete the picture of how theoretical power shifts actually manifest in lived experience across generations. The Vorak Empire fell because they misunderstood human nature at its most fundamental level. They saw our protective instincts as vulnerabilities rather than strategic advantages. Remember that the smallest actions, a child's question, a farmer's intervention, can rewrite galactic history when they reveal universal truths. Empires built on fear crumble when they encounter species that respond to threats with innovation instead of submission. Humans, as it turned out, were really good at holding grudges, and they had long memories. The galaxy learned some lines shouldn't be crossed no matter how powerful you believe yourself to be.